Good evening. You join me, Shamit Sagar, at the Public Policy Institute at University of Western Australia just after 5 p.m. locally. I'm sure many people have been joining in from here in WA, maybe across Australia, and in fact globally, wherever you are in your time zone, you're very welcome joining us this afternoon. You're joining the Public Policy Institute's online event dealing with women on top, focusing specifically on issues of progression, not just participation in the labour market, and specifically within that on top jobs. This is our event for this evening, and we're going to be joined by a distinguished chair and a panel in a short while. Let me just quickly puff out my feathers and say something about the Institute while I've got your attention. The Institute was established here in late 2018, early 2019. Shortly after that, I was recruited to become the inaugural director. And to cut a very long story short, the Institute exists for the purpose of ensuring that our leading research-intensive university here in WA is on the front foot in terms of communicating and interacting with policymakers, but in fact a whole host of research users and practitioners. My great privilege, therefore, to be the director of that institute. You can take in your own time a little tour around what the Institute does in great detail if you want. And this evening's event online is in a sense very characteristic of the kind of debates or convening function that we have in terms of making sure that we're identifying and trying to get ahead of the issues that are salient here in this part of Australia, but in fact right across the country as a whole. We go back to, in a sense, the founding mission of the University of Western Australia when in the early part of the 20th century it was established to quote unquote serve the needs of the people of Western Australia. So in that sense, we believe we're very much part and parcel of that tradition. Before I go any further, as is our custom, can I share with you the UWA acknowledgement, the Indigenous acknowledgement, and that is to say that it is the case that we meet this afternoon, or at least we meet certainly ourselves here in Perth on Noongar land, and we acknowledge the fact that the Noongar people remain the cultural and spiritual custodians of that land. And naturally, we would pay tribute to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. But just reinforce that much more importantly, much more personally, it gives me great pleasure to share with you the fact that we are meeting on a land that was a traditional place of learning amongst the traditional owners of this land. And to have that university, this university here, in a sense, symbolize the continuity of that same tradition, regardless of which period in which we're meeting. So that's an enormous point of pride for ourselves. I'm not going to clog up the front end of this too much longer, you'll be glad to hear. The topic this afternoon that I quickly mentioned was to do with women's penetration into senior jobs, particularly here in Australia. The idea was first sort of kicked around internally when we noted that actually within universities there has been, if you've been observing these things over the last couple of decades, the rapid and unmistakable feminization of the workforce. When I came into academia 35 years ago, it was a bloke's game, overwhelmingly, and that's regardless of which discipline you were in. And we've seen a big amount of change in the last 10, 20 years, but it's not apparent at the top. A quick glance through the annals of vice chancellors here in Australia will tell you that it looks very similar to the kind of vice chancellors you see in the country from which I hail, the United Kingdom. In other words, it continues to be a bit of a bloke's game. And so we wanted to interrogate that further, and lo and behold, we started looking, of course, at other sectors, whether it's the professions, the new or the traditional ones, whether we're looking at politics, parliaments in particular, whether we're looking at the cultural and artistic sectors, and so on and so forth. So this is a kind of comparative across the board look at all of that. As I said, you didn't really tune in this afternoon to hear from me. It's the last thing you want to do. You want to hear from our panel and our chair. So can I just quickly move to that and say to you that I'm delighted that we are this afternoon and honoured to have as our chair Diane Smith-Gander. Diane will be known to many people who are tuning in, but just in case not, some of the headlines include that, for example, she is the chair of the board of the business school where we are based here at UWA. She's also the chair of the CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, the national version of that, not the state version, and plays a very important role. In your own time, you can dip into her CV and her biography. She and I first came across each other, you may recall, in I think 2019 or 2020, when she was conducting a regulatory capability review in relation to one of our financial regulators, APRA. as a past regulator, I kind of had an interest, so we struck up a bit of a conversation and friendship. But I learned in the preparation for this that two things are important. That one, in her citation for the Order of Australia in 2019, it specifically does draw attention to the fact that she was awarded that for distinguished service to business and to women's engagement in executive roles, gender equality, and to the community. And the corollary of that, of course, is that she tells me that she's been always, in some way, shape, or form, a feminist with a small f, but she particularly was drawn to the issue and the challenge of gender equality as recently as 2015, when she looks at the kind of things she specifically got involved in. So I think we're in great company having Diane chair the event this afternoon. Two tiny words of housekeeping before I hand over to Diane. The first is, overall, we'll be exiting at 7 p.m. local time here. The sort of live time of debate and discussion will be just a little bit over an hour. We will be recording this for further dissemination on YouTube and beyond, and specifically to remind the audience that if they've got questions they want to put, to use the Q&A function on Zoom, and then we'll do our best to sort of curate them in logical order as per the chairing of this event by Diane. You've heard more than enough from me. Let me now hand over to my colleague, Diane. Diane.
Thank you very much, Shamit. I am also on Wajak Noongar Budja, so let me acknowledge the traditional owners and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. You know, I think Indigenous women, like any group that has more than one dimension of disadvantage intersecting with another, should be very much on our minds when we think about the progression towards top jobs. You know, I very much like my top jobs as a non-executive director. But it's very confronting to understand that there is not even one Indigenous female non-executive director in the companies in the ASX 50. It was only very recently that our very own Ben Wyatt, here from Western Australia, with his Woodside and Rio directorships, managed to have Indigenous people represented at all in that sort of a top job. And this absolutely must change. Look, let me say at the outset, I do believe that the conversation on the topic of women's economic security and workforce participation has matured, and look, isn't it about time? I, for one, am delighted that the debate is no longer centred on fixing women, changing our style, improving our confidence. Now we give airtime to the root cause of cultural bias against women and the real structural issues that have resulted from this cultural bias into our economy. Now, of course, not everyone has walked to this point, and there is much to do to enlighten more Australians. That's particularly true to enlighten certain men. Now, a number of you have already participated in our panel by sending in questions on notice in advance, and thank you so much for that. And there was one questioner who described these certain men as our culture's ideal worker, the white man working full-time, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. plus unpaid overtime. And these, of course, are the people who still hold most of the power in Australia today, as Shamit has pointed out for the university sector. So it should concern us all that this is the group that still have the most need to change. And I've always regarded Liz Broderick's choice of the label male champions of change as quite inspired. It was very clear to me that those males in those very powerful positions really did need to change. And the only way they would change was if they thought they were championing something that their peer group was going to sign on to. So very smart of Liz. Now, from all of those questions that you did send on notice, I was able to synthesise 4 highlights, which I really think strike to the maturing of the debate that I've talked about. And I'd like to frame those up before I bring our really outstanding panel to bear. Firstly, as I just mentioned, our discussion on the issues has moved on from the superficial. So the lack of respect and its link to domestic violence is no longer questioned. Unpaid work is actually now a topic of conversation, and we have moved on from asking women to fix themselves. As a result of this, we've stopped talking headline numbers and averages. The average is a particularly dangerous thing. Alison will probably tell us a bit about that. But we're now peeling the onion. We're considering sectoral issues way beyond those headlines, and we're starting to delve into the wonderful WGEA data set, which is a unique national asset for Australia that I think we built almost by accident. And there is no argument that it is about inclusion, not just diversity. And this makes us really understand that the most important place for us to be concerned about 50-50 parity representation for women is actually in leadership. Because it's only when women are in the top jobs, in the leadership roles, that we will truly have inclusion of women's voices. We can have 50-50 in entry-level roles, 50-50 across our economy, but we are really only included in the debate if we are in those leadership roles. And the other thing that came through in your questions is that we do actually now hear quite reasoned demands for our governments at all levels to step up and take a real role in framing the issue. Now, some of our political leaders do not want to do this. They don't want to take the important step to framing the problems that we've got and working towards changing our culture. But people like Grace Tame and Brittany Higgins are not going to let them get away with that. They want to hold our political leaders to account so that they do set a proper cultural frame and then hold people who transgress against that to account. This is something that goes on in corporate Australia, and we see it now actually baked into our legislation and regulations as sexual harassment, respect at work, has very clearly become part of creating a safe and diverse workplace right across Australia, which I think is a really very important step. So let me now turn to our stellar panel. Firstly, the Honourable Jessica Shaw, MLA, member for Swan Hills. Now, Jessica tells me she's unmarried, has never chosen to live with a partner for any significant length of time, doesn't have children like me, and says she might be regarded as having an unhealthy level of obsession with her work, a bit like me, and sees the flip side of this situation as sometimes a bit of a lack of the forms of support that are provided by having a family. I've always wanted to have one of those traditional wives that would help support me. Commissioner Tony Emanuel is with us as well. She is a commissioner on the Industrial Relations Commission in Western Australia and a storied lawyer. But for the past 15 years, it's been a daily Ashtanga yoga practice that has allowed her to balance life's competing demands, something I am actually not good at, either yoga or balancing competing demands. Our third panellist is Sheila Magasta, who was raised and educated mostly in Zimbabwe, and she has an arts career which has allowed her to live and work around the world. Her first major project when she moved to live in Australia was the installation of the Inside Australia sculpture at Lake Ballard in the WA Goldfields. I hope everyone's been to see that. It is amazing. And I think this engagement with really remote communities, Aboriginal culture, and our incredible landscape is what began her passion for WA's unique cultural ecology. She is, of course, very soon moving into a government role, so she'll be one of those people we want to frame the conversation in a different way for us. And finally, Winthrop Professor Alison Preston, who was born in New Zealand but grew up in a small mining town in Scotland. And at the time never envisaged she would end up living in a big mining town and pursuing an academic career in economics. Indeed, she only came to Perth because it was in the days when you could get on an aeroplane, and it was the first flight out of Bali back in 1987. She was visiting Ubud, a super place, but was chased by a pack of Bali dogs. So I think she wanted to get out of Dodge fast. She landed a job as a research assistant in the then Department of Economics at Murdoch University, and the rest is really history now. You can read the more formal CVs of our panel at your leisure. I am now going to turn to our 4 topics of debate, but please do continue to add questions and put them into the Q&A part. I know that people love to have chat during these Zoom webinars. as a moderator and facilitator of this panel, there is absolutely no way I can afford to read your chat, because you will get me so interested in the conversation you're having with each other that I will completely forget to properly moderate. So you will see a Q&A button, and that is where I'm going to be looking for any new questions. So Jessica, maybe I could turn to you. As I said, the issues have moved on from the superficial. Do you think that is actually right? What's your reaction to that?
I think recently, well, firstly, thank you for the invitation to participate in the discussion this evening. I actually begin by acknowledging the Wadandi people of the Noongar Nation. I'm down in Bunbury at the moment. I've been leading the government's consultation process on our tourism strategy, and we've just done an industry roundtable. So I'm slightly out of Whadjuk territory, but down here on Wadandi ground, and I acknowledge the traditional owners. Look, the debate obviously has moved on really quite significantly, I think, in the last few years. And I would also acknowledge that, that today is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And, you know, that is today. And there's a global 16-day campaign heightening awareness about violence against women. And in fact, in Western Australia, we have 16 days in WA, and a lot of people will probably start to see quite a bit of material in their socials drawing attention to the women's violence against women and the importance of activism and speaking up. The theme for this year is very much focused on seeing something and saying something, and certainly women's issues have become far more visible in the last couple of years in particular. And as you mentioned, there's been some very high profile media issues and some very high profile women who have come to the fore and been very brave in their advocacy. I suppose thinking about that, there's obviously a very public campaign, but I want to highlight something that I think that the prominence of these issues has created space for, and that is the private conversations between women about their lived experiences as well. Once the Brittany Higginses and Grace Tame's experiences came to the fore, had conversations with important women in my life, and so many women, about experiences that we'd all had, that we hadn't felt, even with our closest women in our lives, we hadn't felt that we'd been able to have before. And that is something that I think has come to prominence as well, that it seems that there are safer spaces now for us to have these conversations and us to talk about these issues that affect us in our economic lives, our private lives, our relationships in our families and with our spouses. Just conversations now that we haven't been able to have before that are very important. And I think that those young women that have found a voice and have been prepared to trailblaze, that have created the ability for so many other women to come forward. I watched Australian Story earlier this week with Grace Tame's story, as I'm sure many did. And when she was made Australian of the Year, one of the highlights, or I suppose the key points of her story as it was portrayed, was that she had had thousands of women come forward and want to tell their stories, and the support that she needed. And I just think previously it was very difficult for women to find a voice. Now we have one, and I want to acknowledge all the men that acknowledge the need for that, and who have also been so receptive to hearing our stories and validating them and acknowledging that they are real, and for both those women and men who have agreed that we need to do something about these issues.
Thanks, Jess. You know, how does that strike our other panellists? Is it these moments of crisis and scandal that do act as a catalyst for change? You know, has it been the Me Too movement? And are you having the same sort of conversations that Jess has talked about within your female cohort? Tony, would you like to give us your thoughts?
It's an interesting question. I think in response to, or first of all, also I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Noongar land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. In terms of those conversations, absolutely. I think the public debate in the last year or so, particularly around the Me Too movement, has sparked those sorts of conversations. And I'm really conscious, working in the space in any event over the last sort of 16 plus years, I'm working with some of the most vulnerable women in employment. I've heard countless tales about sexual harassment and discrimination, and some of it's latent and the less sort of overt experience, and some of it was really blatant and would shock people that it still goes on, but it absolutely does still go on. So yes, I do think the conversation's been sparked.
Sheila, we were talking the other night about the impact of the pandemic in, many different ways, particularly on the arts and culture sector. So how do you see that? We're saying, yes, Tony believes that. We've seen this real impetus through Grace Tame, Brittany Higgins, the Me Too movement. And has the pandemic piled on and added to that or changed it in some other way? What's your thoughts on that?
It has, absolutely. And, just reflecting on when Tony was talking, I was thinking about, going beyond the superficial. One of the key things about feminism, one of the kind of things we've grappled with for decades now is, in order to confront a power and a culture that is, you're trying to change, do you need to take on the attributes of that power in order to defeat it? Or can you retain what some feminists have argued, a distinctly feminine approach to some of this problem solving and still assert a power? And I think that gets even more layered when we go beyond the superficial, as you mentioned in your introduction, when you bring in women of different cultures into this conversation. So that is really reflected in the arts culture, because a large part of the arts is feminized, but operates in a way that is outside of what you would say is conventional power structures. And when COVID hit, it really showed the vulnerability of that. And I'm thinking that Tony is probably referring to similarities in the women that she's working with, in that it was a highly casualized labor force. The value of creative work was kind of diminished. And also, there were little structures that responded appropriately to help people in that situation. But we're talking about people who, even when they are in a good zone, are earning up to 30% below their male counterparts, have lower superannuation, etc., and struggle to maintain a kind of household level of normality compared to the rest of Australia.
Yeah, Alison, you've spent, a lot of time, I think, thinking about some of those wage issues and how that actually, happens. How does that strike you, around the pandemic with this, a whole bit of better understanding of what that unpaid work looks like, and the real tenuous nature of some people's work?
Look, absolutely. I think we all know that COVID really, really laid bare the work that women do that's unseen or unvalued, we should say, the unpaid side of it. And we saw the double shift really come to bear when they were now no longer able to necessarily give the paid work their attention, because they had so much responsibilities that they had to contend with in the unpaid sphere. But in terms of the valuation side of that, and going forward in this, Diane, we know that unpaid work is a real problem for participation side, and we know that care work is continually undervalued. I don't know how far you want me to go right now in terms of talking how we might prosecute that, but certainly I think there's no question that COVID has laid bare the situation of how women have to balance the unpaid work and the paid work. It really brought it to light.
Well, the Grattan Institute. Sorry, Diane.
No, go ahead, Tony, please. We all should elegantly interrupt each other, and let's just keep on doing that.
Thank you. The Grattan Institute referred to that as women experiencing the COVID triple whammy. So being more likely to lose their jobs, doing even more unpaid work than men. Now, obviously, everybody did additional unpaid work, but women did more of that than men did. And women were also more likely, or rather less likely, to receive government support.
One of our questioners used the words mental load. I think that's part of this as well. Is that a concept? Is that a thing? How do we all think about that? Yeah, go, Tony, you go first, and then let's hear from everybody on this one.
Oh, did you hear me? Well, you must have seen me burst out laughing. It is definitely a thing, and whether that's mental load or emotional labour or however people talk about it. I think in large part that's probably what Annabel Crabb was talking about when she talks about the wife drought and the effect of basically having, whether you are the person who's managing all of that, doing the household management and keeping all the balls in the air. You can outsource many things, but it's pretty hard to outsource that emotional labour, whether that's because you're looking after kids or a family or caring for other people.
Alison, is this something that we can analyse, value, dig into using the sort of tools and techniques you've got?
Yeah, but perhaps just before I go there, I mean, I also had a little laugh when you said it as well, Diana. I think part of the mental load is just like the juggling. You're trying to work out what you're doing when you're picking the kids up, when you're trying to do the work. But the other part, I think, of the mental load that maybe this is more anecdotal, but if I think of myself, I do have 3 children. I've got 3 boys, but thankfully they're no longer children and I've not got the same responsibility for them. My husband worked part-time and afforded me the ability to work full-time, because you almost don't want to pursue a career in academia unless you work full-time, because the structures don't really lend for part-time work. We might return to that a bit more in this discussion. But some of the mental load for me was the guilt, the absolute guilt that I faced of feeling that I wasn't there for my children. I can remember writing a paper one day on work and family, which is my area, and my kids are asking for attention. I say, no, go away, I've got this paper to finish on work and family. So I think part of that mental load is the guilt that we still feel as mothers in work. And I've had male colleagues say to my wife takes doesn't work. My wife takes mothering seriously, and I say, "What? You don't take fathering seriously? Is that why you're working?" So I think that's also just part of the debate. And in terms of the tools to analyse it, yes, there are tools, and we've been actually doing a survey of academics, sorry, not just academics, of university staff during COVID, because as you know, the university sector had its particular challenges in terms of the way the government supported the university sector through COVID. And part of the analysis is absolutely showing us is the extra work, the mental work that women in particular have carried through this, particularly through the care of not being able to necessarily be with the elder parents that are needing care, and at the same time having to find new ways of trying to do their work in a home environment, but not necessarily supported. So yeah, there are methods to analyse it for sure, and it definitely shows up as a gendered side.
Thanks, Alison. I think this is a very interesting topic. You just talked about flexibility, and certainly we've had a lot of questions in our pre-submitted questions on notice around that whole notion of flexibility. We're talking about top jobs, progression towards top jobs. I think you can see there are some jobs that can be made very, very flexible. At Telstra, they said all jobs flex, and they didn't mean just entry-level jobs. They meant jobs all the way up to the top of the organisation. And I think in some ways, very senior people who have real control over their work day will have more flexibility. I always, struck me how it was pretty easy at Scotch March Out Day for all those very high-powered Western Suburbs dads, who had their boys marching out, always managed to get to March Out Day. They didn't have any problem with that sort of level of flexibility. But how open really are businesses, government, all sorts of organisations to allowing their top jobs to be flexible, part-time or job share? What's your reflections on that whole, sort of flexibility piece? I think you're in a very particular sort of a workplace.
Look, certainly in terms of job share, there can only be one member for Swan Hills, so we're pretty stuck to one member constituencies in Parliament. Look, part of the biog that you gave was part of a broader discussion about sort of unpaid work and how unqualified I felt to speak on unpaid work, because I genuinely am all about my job, but I certainly see my colleagues who are other female members of parliament that have their own demands on not only do they have to be a member of parliament, but they also are mums. If they're not just a member of parliament, there are also ministers who have ministerial positions. Myself as a parliamentary secretary, we are also members of parliament. We also have families and other commitments. There's very little flexibility. We in sitting weeks, we start at sort of 8 o'clock in the morning, and we'll sit through often till gone midnight. When we did voluntary assisted dying legislation in the last term of parliament, I got to work at 8 o'clock on Tuesday morning and went home at 6 a.m. on the Friday morning, and we sat around the clock. And that presents real challenges for women coming into parliament. In the Labor Party, we have a large number, more than 50% of our caucus now are women, many of them young women with families. The sitting hours of members of parliament are very challenging. When we're not in parliament, we're working in our ministerial offices. If we happen to be either a minister or a parliamentary secretary, a lot of the events that we need to attend are outside of business hours. As members of parliament, our office opening hours are typically not when our constituents can come and see us. So we will have mobile offices on weekends. We'll attend community events. We try and make ourselves very accessible, and that does really present challenges for women who have family and caregiving commitments within their extended families as well. So politics is it's a fabulous job. Like, it has its own rewards, but it is very challenging. We've only just, for example, created a family room that people can have their children come to within the parliament if they want to spend a bit of time with their mums. I've had colleagues crying their eyes out that they haven't put their children to bed during a sitting week, and their husbands have to carry the load. And for a lot of women, they went sometimes from not being the primary breadwinner and being the primary caregiver to having that completely reversed once they were elected to parliament. And particularly for those sort of surprising elections where in both terms of parliament, we've had members who were unexpected winners and have just gone, crikey, we've got to completely reorient the way we structure our private lives. So it can be a very challenging career for women.
Could I perhaps just jump in there and just say, just back on the part-time and the flexible side. We certainly know of many examples in the private sector where there are part-time workers. My brother works for Westfarmers. He's quite senior in the IT sector, and in fact he reports to two women who are job sharing in that role. And he said that they've obviously managed to work it really well. And what would normally have been one job, they've separated it into two jobs. Except they've probably, I'm not sure if how much the organisation assisted them or whether the two women, which tends to be the case, have found each other. But there's definitely examples of where it can happen at the top level. I have a friend who is a senior partner in a law firm, and she's worked part-time, but she also then does feel as if her career has really been hampered by working part-time in terms of the briefs that she gets and the work she gets to do. But at lower levels, I think part-time work can actually be really detrimental, and it really can actually limit what your career progression might look like. So, I think flexibility is really important, certainly at the top, but I think for lower levels, there's a real penalty for working part-time.
Yeah. Tony, I was wondering whether you thought that maybe the way that the Parliament has got its job set up need a bit of a rejig. Didn't sound like a doable job to me.
Well, I'm somewhat limited in relation to what I might comment on, just given the nature of my role, but that did sound a lot to me like the sorts of challenges that you mentioned that mothers would experience that would be a challenge for anybody there. And it occurred to me that really it's in some ways a shame that the discussion around flexibility can be so focused on women, because it should be an issue for everybody. And as long as we keep I suppose, talking about family responsibilities or caring responsibilities as being a women's issue, I don't know that we're going to get very far with it. And it is amazing what can happen where there's a will to get it done. I mean, you asked about flexibility. Generally, I'd say my experience has been there are some parts of the private sector that have done flexibility really well for a long time. I think in terms of within the public sector, it perhaps depends on different approaches taken within different agencies. At least that's been part of what I've observed. But what I will say is that COVID seemed to make a lot of things possible that nobody thought was possible a year ago. So the speed with which things were brought in, the scale it had to happen, there is no way anybody would have thought that was possible a year before. And when it was necessary and there was a will to do it, suddenly it got done. So perhaps it's about incentivising people to make some of the changes that are necessary.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very fine points. Sheila, you know, you're in the arts sector where work looks different as well. What does flexibility look like there to allow women to progress through into bigger jobs?
It's really quite complicated because there are many types of work within our sector. And I think this is the very interesting gender differential. So there are some forms of work, such as visual art, where you're the producer, creator, a writer, where you do have control, but it's a very isolated pursuit. And often women in that situation do report feeling kind of the lack of social contact. And in that area, they are paid significantly less than male colleagues and the average Australian worker. But then I think in a similar way to what Jess has described at Parliament, there are other areas where it's project-based, and when you're on, and you have to be in the theatre or on tour, or especially if you want to accelerate your career, be available to travel nationally and internationally, and available for productions. And in many cases, your body is your job as well. So it's also about maintaining your health through all of that, let alone the health of your relationships with your family. So I think at that level, it becomes harder and harder, and many people fall out along the way in that sense as well. But I'm also thinking about leadership in our sector. I think, you know, always following the money is an interesting thing. And Me Too highlighted at the top end the differentials between wages paid to leading artists. So, you know, Sheila McGudzard versus Brad Pitt. And there were, you know, a couple of $1 million difference between us. But, you know, if you go further down the chain, what you often find is that in the commercial area, like the major touring productions, especially in commercial music, are 80 to 90% male-owned, number one, and male-managed, number two. And these are the kind of big financial risk areas. And in senior leadership, say in our national institutions, at the moment, that's completely male, all three national cultural institutions. And what intrigues me about that, it's, you know, kind of, where's the money, but it's about also where is the creative risk. And one of the factors that interested me in the research I did is that whilst women may generally be being paid 25% less than men in our sector, if you isolate the creative women, the creative production, so the actual artists, it increases to 30%. And I think this is tied very closely to leadership, because it's about banking trust and confidence in women and how they, you know, produce, act, etc., lead. And so, you know, a woman who is going to be a conductor or an opera director or receive a major commission from a gallery is likely to get paid less for it. And there are fewer of them offered those opportunities.
Yeah, this is one of the really very difficult things, you know, having these opportunities offered to you, recognising those opportunities when they are offered, understanding they're even available. And we have an interesting question in the Q&A about this whole notion of career milestones and, you know, how you get yourself on the track towards leadership. You know, so how do you self-identify that you're heading for a role in leadership? So, you know, all of our panelists, you're all leaders. How did you work it out? What was it that told you that you were going to end up in one of these roles? So I'm going to go around my screen in order, which means I start with Tony. What was your journey like on working out that you were going to get to be a leader?
Well, it was almost a running joke in my household that between my husband and I, that the only thing that was going to get me to leave my previous role, which was as Principal Solicitor of the Employment Law Centre, a statewide service providing free legal advice to vulnerable workers in the state, was to become a commissioner. And I would say to him, and that's not going to happen, so this is what I'm doing. And then it was offered. And at the time that I was considering looking at it, we'd had our second child, and she was a really young baby. And I had a moment of thinking, the timing isn't necessarily ideal. I was still working full time, but to shift into such a different role, and I was 35 at the time, and my husband had a full-on legal job that involved a lot of travel, and there were a lot of balls in the air. And really, I suppose I thought about it and thought, well, there's no guarantee I'll ever be asked again. I'm going to take it while it's offered. But you also made me think about a moment that happened earlier in my career. And that was about a male colleague who was senior to me when I'd moved across to work at the Community Legal Centre. I came across as a solicitor, and there was a more experienced male lawyer called Mark who was in the principal solicitor role. And after we'd worked together for about 5 months, he did something that blew me away. It was certainly not in the realm of my experience coming from a big top-tier firm. And I don't think this is the sort of thing that would happen very often. But really, he was a champion of change. And he came to me and said, look, we're working at the same level. You are doing the work of the principal solicitor. We should be job sharing. So in effect, I can see your eyebrows going up, Diane, and it was extraordinary. He then put a case to the board. The board of management had the will to do it, but he persuaded the board. And I was elevated really quickly in that way because there was someone in the role who was willing to create space. So I wanted to acknowledge that because I think that put me on a different trajectory. And I would never have asked for that to have happened, not because I didn't think I was doing a good job, it just wouldn't have occurred to me. So I really appreciate that. And since then, there are occasions when I remind myself to channel the confidence of a mediocre white man in terms of that being a gender difference sometimes, that women tend to, of course these are stereotypes, but I think more often than not, women will wait until they're 120% of the way there before they put themselves forward. And there are plenty of men who will have a crack, whether they're there or not, and feel very confident about their right to be there. So I think it's sort of a combination of things, really.
Yeah. For me, I think it was the role modelling I got from my mum and dad, who both stepped into leadership roles that we were actually talking about just before we started the panel, unpaid leadership roles. So I had seen that and I saw what it needed to be successful in those sorts of roles, being organised, being prepared to open your mouth and have a perspective. And so I sort of saw myself as, I can do that. So that was how I sort of felt that I should head towards leadership. How about you, Alison?
These are really interesting questions, and it's nice to have that chance to just sit and reflect. Gosh, what was my journey? And I know we've only got a limited amount of time to go through it, but perhaps there's two parts for it. One was when I was in my 20s. I was in Canberra. I was working in the Commonwealth government, and I'm quite competitive. You wouldn't necessarily choose a job as an academic economist if you weren't a degree of competition there. But anyway, I was in Canberra. I was my head of department was acting. I didn't think he had much more to offer than I did for the job, and in fact we weren't necessarily getting on very well. And he was applying for the actual job because he was acting, and I thought, I need to put my hat in the ring for this. If I don't want to work for this guy because I think I'm actually better than him, then I need to better go through the process. And I went through the process, and I got the job. And I found since then I've been in a number of different situations. When I subsequently went into academia, I remember applying for promotion and said, no, we're not going to support you because X has been here longer. And I thought, God, I'm not going to have my whole career trapped out because X was a male, is notionally ahead of me in this queue. So I reached out to a senior female professor in economics at the time, and she was absolutely fantastic, and she mentored me, but she also championed me. And I think there's that difference between mentoring and pointing out some of the pitfalls, and there's the part of the champion as well. And so the championing for me, a bit what you were just saying there, Tony, was telling me, you know, you should be applying for promotions, and that's exactly what I did, because of what you just said, that women will wait till they're 120% ready to go. Although just quickly on that one, I did apply, understanding the literature on this, understanding that women tend to really wait till they feel as if they've got every box ticked. So I applied for professor, and I was appointed to professor relatively young at the time. And that was great, and I was delighted. And the first time I met the Vice Chancellor after that, he said, "Congratulations, Alison." And he said, "We took a punt on you." And I thought, "Oh, I'm a punt?" And I spoke to my colleague, I said, "I'm a punt." And she said to me, "Oh, for God's sake, don't you think all the other guys are punts as well? They just don't say it to the guys." So yeah, you know, that's really been my journey. It's had a few people that have helped tell me, you know, when to apply, and then you start to understand it yourself. And what you want to do when you get to these positions is repeat the same for others that are coming up behind you.
Don't we all have those dreadful moments, you know, where people say things like that to us, you know, taking a punt on you? One of the things that makes me know the world is changing is when you see, you know, in the popular media, you know, particularly on drama shows, where there's very different language and so forth. And I was watching something the other night, can't even remember what it was, but it had my attention for a few minutes at least. And there was a woman on it, and she was having a, you know, a bit of a conflict with one of the male characters, and they met at a social event, and he made a comment about her clothing and how lovely she looked, and she just zinged back at him, "There you go again. The only opening conversational ambit you've got with a woman is about her appearance." And I thought, how often does that happen to all of us? And I've never thought to say something like that, but you better watch it. The next bloke that compliments me on something, I'm just probably going to get that one. But Jess, maybe you could reflect a little bit on when you realised you had the leadership gas in the tank.
Well, it's an interesting journey. I mean, I want to absolutely agree with some of the points that have been made. Firstly, on the realising that or the thought that you have to be 120% ready. So I'm almost an accidental politician. I suppose I started my proper professional career in international relations, and which is what I was studying at the time, and was working as the political attaché at the British High Commission. And it was while I was still at university, finishing off a degree, and I wasn't absolutely sure whether or not I should do that job, but I thought, no, I'll give it a go. And then I went into the Senate as an advisor to the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee very early in my career, and probably at a point when I wasn't sure if I was quite qualified for it, but I thought, no, I'll have a go. I then went off and did some postgraduate study, came back to Australia, and I decided to completely change my career, and for whatever reasons, went into the energy sector, and started at the bottom of the tree and just thought for something different, and ended up as the sort of national business development manager, if you like, for overseas multinational energy infrastructure company, and a job I had no qualifications for, and had no idea that when I started a career in energy policy, because I knew a bit about policy, that I would end up working in, you know, at an executive level in the commercial sector. And but it's because when doors opened, even though I wasn't qualified, I was prepared to just have a go. And I just think women need to have the confidence to do that. Now, my progression, and then again, I sort of got to the point in my commercial career where I felt like I wanted to make a different contribution. So I've been a leader in a corporate sense, but I felt that there were particularly around energy and climate change, I felt that there wasn't enough being done. And I thought, well, you can either stay working in the corporate sector, or you can decide to do something about it. And so I decided to run for Parliament and take a community leadership position. But all the way through, I've had mentors and I've had champions, and particularly in the energy sector, they've been men. There are very few women working in leadership positions in the energy sector, although I will say, pleasingly, many more now than when I started. But I've always had fabulous mentors and champions. And one of the interesting things in the corporate world that I observed was it was really hard when I was at those junior levels to push forward and walk into a room and not be treated like I was an idiot. But then you get to a certain point where you demonstrate that you have the capacity, and the gender imbalance becomes more and more pronounced the more senior you become. We've got lots of young graduate engineers now, lots of young women working in resources and energy, but at senior leadership positions, very few women. And particularly on executive teams, when you've got an executive team, the one woman on the executive team is usually the general manager, human resources. There are very few women who are general manager commercial or general manager operations. And so you get to a certain point in your career where all of a sudden, as companies have become very aware that they have a gender balance problem, all of a sudden you become really in demand to step into those executive level positions as a woman. So there's a change going on there. But I don't think I didn't consciously make a decision that I wanted to lead. I just wanted to do a really good job, and I had fabulous leaders who helped me do that and become the best that I can be, and have encouraged and helped me. You have your detractors. You always have sometimes other women who aren't necessarily they like to be the only woman in a room full of men, and they'll be resentful of other women around them. And you'll also have men that will accuse you of being arrogant or aggressive when what you're actually being is assertive and demonstrating the sort of qualities that in men are rewarded. You just got to push through that and identify who your squad are that are cheering for you, and who the people around you are that are supporting you. And leadership is not something that I think any of us make a conscious decision to become or to do. It's just part, I suppose, of our personal journeys and just the places we find ourselves in when we choose to back ourselves and make sometimes very brave decisions about our career paths.
Thanks, Jess. Very much an on-point comment. Sheila, I'm going to ask you to comment on your leadership journey, when you saw the milestone. And then I'd like to pivot us to a really neat question that Amy Lynn has asked about the role of mentorship in getting you to leadership positions. And perhaps we could consider that in the context of what Jess has just talked about around, the GM HR role versus the GM ops role, or as I call it, the support handmaiden role and the cash register role. And I'm going to come to Tony to talk about that, because I think it's an inclusion sort of question, including women in the real decision making. But Sheila, tell us about your leadership milestones, and then Tony will come back to you on that this new topic.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned mentorship, because absolutely every time I've stepped up in a leadership space, it's been with the encouragement of other women. But the things that I think are important when I reflect, like you, Diane, I think of my parents. They were real rule breakers. They broke a lot of social and political conventions in the way they formed our family. So we we're always brought up kind of questioning the reality or the norm around us and going, well, is that the way that we really believe? And then, of course, a good, strong Catholic education always braces you for the idea of, leadership as service. That's really, I think, an important thing as well. And that was backed up when I did the Cranlana leadership program with the Maya Foundation. And again, it was about ethical leadership. And before you step into any of these spaces, really grounding yourself in what are my values and why am I here, being very conscious about that, because there's no point taking up airtime in a space unless you're very, really sure about that. But once you've got those things kind of lined up within yourself, it does give you a lot more confidence to go against the norm, to say what you feel. And the other thing I would actually mention is the UWA Women's Leadership Program, which was started decades ago when the imbalance at UWA it rated the worst university in either Australia or Western Australia for women in leadership. So they instigated a women's leadership course, and I went on it. And at the time, I kind of mostly dozed away, listening to professors of engineering talk about, terrible things that were happening amongst their colleagues. But later, when I became a parent and a single parent, all those conversations came back to me, because those women were raising families at the time. I wasn't. And I did draw upon those conversations much later in life when I was considering how I was going to balance being a parent with some of these things as well.
Thanks, Sheila. Tony, let's turn to you and that question I teed up before, you know, about mentorship and inclusion and so forth, and getting into those roles where you're really making the decisions that count.
Look, I mean, mentorship is really important, and diversity is most meaningful when there is inclusion. So I think of it as, actually the Diversity Council of Australia has got really, really useful, accessible materials on its website, but diversity being the what and inclusion being the how and the why. Because diversity works best, obviously, when people feel included. So diversity is around having that mix of people with different social identity and different professional identity. So whether the social identity might be having an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background, sexual orientation or age or disability, any number of things. Professional identity around people's education and the profession they're in, the location they're in, for example. But inclusion's looking at getting that diverse mix of people with different perspectives and different backgrounds, and how they work together to enhance the performance and the well-being in the workplace. But that doesn't work unless people are actually included, and that means being heard and being part of the conversation. And that probably is where mentoring can play a big role. So that's where people feel respected. They're able to be themselves. They're not having to wear a different sort of, you know, be a different self at work, but they're respected for who they are. They're connected. They feel like they belong. They contribute. They feel like their ideas are valued, their perspectives valued, their talent is actually valued and used, and they progress. So they need to have equal access to opportunities and to resources, and mentoring does make a big difference. Now, we've said it earlier in this session, but there is no question that the underrepresentation of women in the workplace is most evident the more senior you get. And I think that's true in almost every sector, and that's public sector and private sector, even in areas where women vastly outnumber men. So if you look at some of the sectors where there are far more women than men, at the pointy end of things, at the really senior influential level, that's not the case. So I think that's why it's so important that we do have women in those senior leadership positions, and women able to mentor other women coming through. And I suppose it's worth, I think you did note it before, but talking about the importance of that intersectionality, that to the extent that, you know, people in the workplace who will feel gender inequality even more will be people who have overlapping or intersecting identities or backgrounds where they will experience other biases. So it might be bias on the grounds of race or cultural background, for example, or LGBTQI status and gender, and they will have the most difficult time in the workplace.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. That's very true. Alison, maybe we could ask you to unpick a little bit, you know, this whole notion of the undervaluation of predominantly female occupations and industries, and maybe reflect on whether the fact we don't have as many female economists as we probably need, and particularly in senior leadership positions. So I do know there are some very senior female economists in Federal Treasury, at the Reserve Bank and so forth, but how does that piece play in?
Yes, thanks, Diane. I'm sorry to have missed some of the discussion there. My internet dropped out at this end. Diane, just going back to the undervaluation of work in feminized sectors, you know, I think it's easy for us to think about women's progress as being somewhat linear, and there's a fly here. If the research shows anything, it shows that it's not at all linear, and that we've had great leaps and bounds. You know, oh, have I dropped out again? Am I still here? Yeah, I wasn't sure if I dropped out again or not. We've had great leaps and bounds through the
No, sadly, there does go, Alison. That's disappointing. I'm going to give her 2 seconds to see if she might be able to come back, because I think she's a bit frozen on the screen. I'm wondering if my co-host is able to remove that sort of frozen picture so that we can get our speaker back on. Apologies for this bit of a technical interruption. Maybe our UWA events people could unmute and give us some guidance. There we go. Okay. Right. Not quite sure what's going on with our picture thing because we now have Tony on the screen. Here she is, Alison. We waited for you. Okay. Why don't you start again on that?
I'm sorry, I can hear you, but obviously I just freeze at this end. So be careful what you're saying about me when you think you can't see me, because I can still hear everything at this end. Let me just speed it up. I think the undervaluation of female work is a real challenge. It's really, really complex, and we've seen it wax and wane in Australia. What I was saying is that we thought it might be linear, but it's not linear. And we did the 2012 Sachs case. You're looking at me, Diane, as if I'm frozen again, have I?
No, your sound, you just need to be a little closer to your microphone, I think.
We saw the social and community services case in 2012 where there was a really great progression there. And then, 3 years later, 2015, there was a much narrower interpretation of what it meant to value women's work. And really, in the past, we've relied a lot on the industrial relations system, the awards, and Tony might want to talk a bit more about that. It's been a fantastic vehicle to prosecute pay equity, but now we've got a much more approach where it's much more individualized. We're not necessarily doing it sector by sector. We'd rather do it by the individual, by the workplace. We've got a much narrower interpretation around what work value really is in terms of sameness difference. So it's really, really, really hard to prosecute. And I think we will really start to see a stalling of pay equity. And even then, when we're talking about pay equity, we're not necessarily talking about remuneration. And so, we might start to get equality in terms of pay, but not equality in terms of remuneration, because the remuneration package takes on, all your superannuation and the fringe benefits, the bonuses, and that's where there's real differences happening as well. And so my own research on this shows that in terms of wages, it's been stable for the last 20 years in Australia. This is at the mean for all workers. But actually where we're seeing discrimination rise is actually for women who are out of the workplace. So they're actually being discriminated against. And so the participation question, I know Shamit said at the beginning, we don't want to talk about participation, we want to talk about progress, but actually we do want to talk about participation as well, because that's where I think we're seeing a lot more discrimination as well. So look, the undervaluation of female work will continue to be a real problem in all sectors. Some will progress it better than others, but it's actually, I think, becoming more of a problem. And we're also seeing the gap starting really younger as well. And so we have not only a glass ceiling in Australia, but we've got a sticky floor. A sticky floor is that women get put on at the bottom and men got put on at a higher level at the, when they start a job as well. So Australia does not have a good track record in this at all, and perhaps because I'm Scottish, but I feel a bit pessimistic about where we're headed.
If I may,
to get all in before I froze.
Alison, could I ask a supplementary question here? Alison, do those figures reflect anything about older women in the workforce? My just personal observation is that at that level, when a lot of people come to their kind of full leadership potential, not only are sometimes women bypassed, but in the mobility part, where people are moving from job to job, women above a certain age tend to get overlooked in that mobility, that you can't move to another workplace and go up. It's that they kind of get written off a bit earlier. And I certainly have had friends who, past a certain age, are struggling to get recognised for the experience they have when getting back into jobs or trying to move across in jobs.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Of course, it very much happens. I mean, we know that there's a real high level of age discrimination happening in Australia as well. And again, I'm just going to give an anecdote, but I said earlier on, my husband's worked part-time when my children were younger. He's a school teacher. He worked part-time. He had time out of the labour market. He went back into a job. He went for an interview. And they asked him, when did he qualify? He told them that he qualified however many years previously. And they said, oh, you're, X number of years, 12, maybe 15. I can't remember what the marker was. years qualified, we'll put you on the top of the scale. There was no question about what he had done in the years between, or whether he'd been out of the labour market or whether he'd been working part-time. All they wanted to know was, when did he qualify? You're the top of the scale. And we know for a fact that that would not happen had he presented as a woman. So yes, and in fact, what I thought your question was going to be, Sheila, was how about the fact that older women coming into the workforce, particularly into the care sector, which we know is atrociously undervalued, their caring skills and their maturity that they bring to that workforce is definitely not valued. And again, just because it's so, sorry, this isn't a reason why it shouldn't be valued, but it's the complexity of how you attach a value to those skills. And there's so much I want to say, Diane, so just one last comment, because maybe it's coming back up in your questions, but the government has a huge role to play in how they properly value women's work, because particularly in the care sector, the government's the major purchasers of care workers. They have a monopsony in this market and they don't properly fund it. You know, the whole procurement process, the whole monitoring process, the way they contract it out, the way they fund it is a real problem, and it's leading to this vulnerability, to these short-term contracts, to the insecurity that's there, and additional stresses as well. But I'll stop, because as I say, I'm talking so fast because I'm scared I'm going to drop out again. So thank you.
Alison, you've always got such a lot to say on this topic. We're very happy to have you, you know, put all of this into the room. So much there, and we do have some really good questions. There's a really interesting question about, you know, personality traits, leadership and so forth, which I think a little bit strikes to what Alison was just talking about, you know, undervalued women in nurturing and caring roles. And, you know, is this sort of thing because women are seen to be more caring and more nurturing, and therefore we will do these sorts of jobs? How do you see that? Yes, you know, do you think there is actually a difference between men and women on these sorts of things? I guess I'm asking the nature and nurture question in a bit of a way.
Look, I think there are differences in the ways that women go about their work. There are differences in the ways that women and men interact with each other, and between one another as well. Look, it's a really interesting one, because in politics, I think it's probably the only workplace in the world where you turn up every day expecting to be bullied. Like it is a hyper-masculine environment. And I will say that this term of Parliament's been very different from the last one, because there is such a significant composition of the chamber, and particularly in terms of gender, I might observe. But you know, in the last term of Parliament, every time, particularly as a new member of Parliament, I got on my feet, the wall of noise that is just presented at you when you're trying to make an argument and you're being shouted down, and some really bad heckles are being levelled at you, and that is incredibly confronting. And the nature of politics is so adversarial, and you watch the way that women go about that work, and particularly in the chamber. You know, it is, sometimes I think it's really, well, it's really destructive. It isn't constructive. The way that the chamber conducts itself is terrible. And I think the expectations that are placed upon women to perform in that environment is to be, you know, get in there and have a bit of a fight. And look, you know, I'll get in there and I'll do it when I have to. But I don't think it reflects well on our democratic process at times. And it actually, in my experience, isn't very reflective of how good quality public policy and decision-making is actually done. When you get away from, I wouldn't even dignify some behaviour I see in Parliament as theatre, I'd say it's pantomime. When you get behind a lot of the pantomime that we see in Parliament, where there's all the booing and the hissing and the Punch and Judy show going on, you actually do see remarkable collaboration, leadership, very effective communication, and that can happen across the chamber. It certainly happens between ministerial officers and the stakeholders, the stakeholder organisations that they deal with. A lot of decision making depends incredibly on consensus building, and women are, I think, really quite strong with that. Our leadership styles tend to be more collaborative, engaging. We can tend to be less combative. Now, having said that, that isn't always true, but you know, there are fundamental differences. I would observe that in a far more feminine caucus, in our caucus where there are more women now than men, and in the parliament where it is more women now than men, there is a different tone. Now, obviously, there's not as many people to make the wall of noise in opposition, so the whole complexion of the parliament is different, but there is a difference when there are more women in decision-making leadership roles, and particularly in environments where decision-making is consensus-based. One other quick observation I'd make, in my past life in the commercial world, my job in sort of business development, very often you just see the different styles of negotiation. Men, again, could tend to be very, very combative and view deal making as zero-sum games, whereas I always liked to approach it as consensus building. Let's find a way to a transaction. And even in my job, I always think about what's the easiest way to get everyone to yes. What's the easiest solution that we can all come up with where we benefit? And I don't know, I just think women tend to be a little more adept at that, perhaps because we've been so used to so long to having to adapt our leadership styles and to be a bit more consensus driven and not quite so confrontational, because some men tend to get a bit affronted by that. So there are differences. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
I think it also raises for me the role of the media, which I see as an adjunct creative industry to the area that I work in, because also in reflecting on today's conversation, you have to acknowledge that a lot of our sector, the broader creative industry sector, has not served women well just by the way they represent women, objectify them, sexualize them, etc., in those stories, but also now the role of media in terms of how they wish to report public debate. Of course, the grabs that they want are the conflictual ones, are the kind of heady talk. There's nothing to report when everyone's being nice with each other, and you know how much that impacts on people's behaviour. There was a great report that came out last week from Curtin University, the Bunckley Economics Centre, about loneliness and social connectedness, and how impacted especially younger women are, of course, we know this, by new forms of media, social media, and you know how that determines what their sense of themselves and their potentiality is. And so I think it's one thing that's inescapable in this conversation, as well as that looming presence that somehow defines often what we think we need to be in certain situations.
I cannot believe that we are so quickly getting towards the end of our time together. It's been a fascinating conversation with everyone bringing in different things, and I really did want to have an opportunity to give everyone to have a final word. You know, we always sort of have this bit of a cultural thing that, oh yes, that's a woman, they've got to have the last word. Often when I'm interviewing and consulting work, I say to people at the very end, what was the one thing you really wanted to tell me that I didn't ask you the right question? You know, I didn't give you the opportunity to say. So what I'm going to do now is go around our panel for the last word. So maybe we can start with Tony for her last word.
Oh, I suppose to have a last word, I'd say I think things are moving in the right direction, but whether they're moving fast enough is a different question. Women have a seat at the table, but it's generally not at the head of the table, and there are not enough women around that table, and that's what needs to change.
Thank you. That's a very succinct last word. How about you, Alison? Your last words.
I think I'm just going to repeat something that I said before, so that my last word is a repetitive word, but I really want to, and maybe you talked about this when I had dropped out, I want to see a much stronger role for government in this, at the state level, but also at the federal level. And if, you know, there's so much that government can do, but let's just ask them to start to work with the feminised areas, the feminised sectors, the healthcare sector would be the obvious one for them to start working with, how they fund it, the disability sector as well, how they fund it, how they monitor it, how they value the work that's done by women in that sector would go a long way. And then I think that that would actually start to feed up into the bigger debate that's happening. And my second one would like to see media change as well. I think you hit it there, Sheila, but maybe that can be your last word this time.
Sheila.
Yeah, that probably is my last word, is, you know, just the influence of especially visual and digital culture in a lot of how we are running these conversations. And I am intrigued by countries that have instigated quotas. I was taken aside by a French ambassador in New Zealand some years ago who just gave me a huge lecture about how life-changing it has been in France when they, first of all, 2001, introduced quotas into directorships of major companies, then they, actually the government first of all, then directorships of major companies, and then I think in the last year or so, they've now moved down to the layer of management, and companies of over 1,000 people have to have 40% women by 20, I don't know, 30 or 50 it is. And I'm just intrigued that that's, you know, a quiet revolution that women seem to say works for them. I would love to hear a conversation in Australia about the appetite for any of those kind of quite tough instruments.
Thank you, Sheila. And Jess?
Look, I really want to endorse the quota model. I think in the Labor Party, we do have a quota. We do have a quota for 50% of not just seats, but winnable seats must have women pre-selected into them. So there's no point pre-selecting women in unwinnable races and then saying, oh yeah, but we've got 50% of women pre-selected. You actually have to put them into places, into seats where they have a red hot go at winning. And in fact, I was pre-selected. I was one of the first 5 seats that needed to be won for Labor to form government, and 3 of those 5 seats had women pre-selected into them to change the gender balance. That flows right the way through our institutional structures. In terms of the leadership within branches, there's quotas around women. Now, we are, as I've said on a number of occasions, at a point now where the majority of women in our caucus are, a majority of our caucus members are women. That isn't the case in Cabinet, but the Premier has made some very public statements about increasing the numbers of women both into parliamentary secretary roles and into Cabinet. And I think it's really, really important that we see it. And I just think the debate's been had now that about merit versus quotas. I just get so frustrated by women who continue to defend this, but if you're good enough, you'll get there. You won't. And I think we had a very tacit acknowledgement of that when Julie Bishop failed to become the Liberal leader. You know, when they said to her, what do you have to say when a talented, popular woman can't become leader of the Liberal Party? And she went deadpan down the camera and said, well, I'm sure when they find one, it'll change, or words to that effect. Like it was a remarkably brave statement about the fact that you actually do need to put institutional structures in place that encourage women. Beyond that, I just want to give a plug to an organisation that I do quite a bit of work with, and that's called She Runs. And we've just gone through our 2nd year of that program, and it is about encouraging women at all levels of government to run and to run for office and to have the support networks placed around them to enable them to run. That comes from mentoring from existing members of parliament right the way through to the sort of support structures that it takes to actually get anyone, be they woman or man, into parliament. And we need quotas. I'm a big fan of them. And we need women to see that there are opportunities for them, to make those opportunities, see that they're there, and then support them when they take them.
Well, these 4 panellists have made life very easy for me. I just had to nudge a little bit, steer the ship a bit. I think you've seen some amazing role modelling here of the sort of conversation that women can have to advocate for our own leadership. We had a question from one of our UWA graduates, Zin, who was saying, you know, how do we handle, you know, bad comments in the corporate environment without biting people's heads off? Now, everyone knows I'm a bit of a head biter offerer at times, but I think you've seen the lovely nuance that you get when people understand their topic, are passionate about it, and are interested to talk about it. And I think that's why women's conversations can be very different, because we are interested in each other's point of view and we're interested in the concepts and the dynamics. And so I think that's how we get to have these sorts of conversations. Let me tell you, I agree with quotas. I don't think there is anything that is not meritorious about identifying that you have a particular category, skill, capability, whatever it may be, that is not represented, and then that itself becomes meritorious. When I joined the Wesfarmers board, they didn't have enough West Australians, they didn't have enough women. Now, I had to meet all the other criteria as well, but at the end of the day, I do see myself as a quota candidate for that particular role. So, Shamit, I'm going to hand back to you now for your closing comments, and I will be interested in your reflection too. I know you're a keen observer of concepts and trends and how they feed in, but it's great to have the UWA Public Policy Institute provide this platform for us to share our thoughts with the participants, and thank you to all of you for coming along, because it wouldn't be a conversation without your questions as well. So, Shamit, over to you.
Just had to be let back in. Can you hear me? Look, Diane, thank you very much for your sharing of that discussion. We've sat here fascinated to listen to all this, myself and the PPI team, and we could carry on all evening, but you know, time prevents us doing so. So I'm enormously indebted to you and all the panelists. I'm not going to repeat the thanks all over again or clog up time. It did strike me just at the very end, whoever said it, you know, what comes next, particularly the role of government and institutions, and how you embed that change that's taking place so that it's kind of irreversible. You want to embed as well as accelerate it. That would be a perfect place for us to take this discussion at the next point at which we get a chance at the PPI. Look, time's run out. Thank you very much for everyone who's tuned in and contributed, particularly those who've asked and had questions put. I'm just going to quickly plug. My notes tell me that on the 1st of December, the Institute is having a Breakfast by the Bay event here at UWA, the club, dealing with prospects for the global economy in 2022, and particularly the implications for WA. It's a ticketed event. Please have a look at our website if you're interested in attending that. It's going to be the last major event that we have of the year. Last point, the Institute here, more than anything else, is here to sort of make sure that big issues are not missed, and we create a platform. And this event this evening, more than anything else, has vindicated that decision to make sure that we have the university and the Institute at the forefront of these debates. But we're only as good as the people who want to take part and the people who want to chip in. So you've done our work for us. Diane and all your colleagues, thank you very much indeed. We'll sign off this evening. Have a good and safe evening wherever you are.